In this video, we continue to explore ways to synthesize carboxylic acid products. In this particular video, our focus is on the reaction known as acid-catalyzed nitrile hydrolysis, where we are going to be starting with a molecule containing a cyano group or nitrile group as a synonym of that. So we're going to start with a molecule that has a carbon-nitrogen triple bond, and we will react that with acid, which I'm going to abbreviate as H+ here, and water. Since we describe this as a hydrolysis reaction, lysis means to break, hydro means water, so we'll be using the water to break away the carbon-nitrogen bonds here, ultimately replacing the nitrile group with a carboxylic acid group in the final product. So our final product will correspond to replacing that CN group with a COOH group, as we see here, using acid as our catalyst in this particular reaction and water as our agent for lysing or breaking that carbon-nitrogen set of bonds there. In this video, we will be looking at the mechanism for this reaction, and we'll be exploring example problems where we are reacting using this type of reaction. Now, as an addition to this particular reaction, generally alkyl halides are very common ways to start reactions. There are many alkyl halides that are commercially available. And so just as a throwback reaction here, I will remind you that if you are not able to start from a nitrile functional group, but instead you have access to alkyl halides, what you can do is, if you have a primary alkyl halide, a primary carbon bonded to that leaving group, you can generally readily react with sodium cyanide, which provides a carb anion nucleophile, like I'm drawing out here, which will attack via an SN2 mechanism the carbon that's bonded to the leaving group as the leaving group leaves, giving us an SN2 reaction that yields our nitrile group that we can then do hydrolysis on to make the carboxylic acid. Keep in mind that this reaction of an alkyl halide with sodium cyanide or some other cyanide-containing molecule will result in the formation of a new carbon-carbon bond as well. That new carbon-carbon bond is what I'm highlighting here in blue. And so this is also a useful way to go about creating a carbon chain that has one additional carbon atom in it before you go through this hydrolysis process. So let's go ahead and continue onward to explore the mechanism for the nitrile hydrolysis in acid. So in exploring the mechanism of the acid-catalyzed nitrile hydrolysis, we will use that same generic reaction that we did in the introduction, where we have an R group here representing whatever ring of carbons or chain of carbons is attached to the nitrile group. We react with acid and water, and we are going to generate, as a result of that reaction of nitrile hydrolysis, a carboxylic acid group in the final product. So let's take a closer look at the nuts and bolts of how this reaction is actually working. What is the mechanism for this reaction? So we have our nitrile group, which has a lone pair of electrons on the nitrogen. We have acid present in the reaction mixture. And so based on what we have learned all along about reactions and mechanisms and reactivity, generally if you have a relatively strong acid present, what's going to happen in the first step of a mechanism is going to be protonation. So we're going to go ahead and protonate, and what we will protonate here is we can bring the lone pair of electrons from the nitrogen over to attack that proton, creating a protonated organic intermediate. So we'll go ahead and show that protonated organic intermediate of that new NH bond. That's going to result in the nitrogen now having 4 covalent bonds and therefore a positive formal charge. And keep in mind that this resonance structure is stabilized because that positive charge can be shared over 2 different atoms, because we can take a pi bond from that nitrile group, move it over onto the nitrogen, and therefore share the positive charge across the carbon and the nitrogen. So nitrogen then would have a lone pair of electrons in this resonance structure, still has that proton bonded there, and now the positive formal charge resides on the carbon atom. In this scenario, our carbon atom, we can see, based on resonance, because we can draw a resonance structure that has a positive charge, and induction, because the carbon is bonded to an electronegative atom, the carbon is going to be quite electrophilic. And so what will happen here is that the electrophilic carbon, that is now even more electrophilic than it was in the starting material, due to the fact that we've had this protonation step take place, that electrophilic carbon is going to be prone to attack by the nucleophile that's present in the reaction. And when we look at the reaction mixture, what we have available as a nucleophile here is we have water. And so what will happen here in the second step of the mechanism is that the water is going to come in and attack this electrophilic carbon. And so let's go ahead and show that happening. So I'm going to go ahead and show my reaction arrow there, my arrow to the next intermediate. And I'm going to go ahead and name this step, which is that the nucleophilic water attacks the electrophilic carbon-nitrogen bond, which is much like a carbonyl group in terms of how it is going to behave. So now we can show our water coming in. I'm going to go ahead and mixing up my colors here. I'm going to go ahead and make my water come in as a purple molecule. So water comes in, H2O, use one of its sets of lone pair electrons to attack the electrophilic carbon. You can show that in either of these two resonance structures. It doesn't matter which one. You just need to show that the water is coming in and attacking the electrophilic carbon. So let's draw what results from that nucleophilic attack of water on the electrophilic carbon atom. So I'm redrawing my original organic intermediate right here. I'm redrawing it down here. And now it's going to have a new covalent bond to water onto that carbon that was the electrophile. So we have OH2 here. That is now going to result in the positive charge residing on the oxygen atom here of our water, H2O. Now, at this point, what will happen next in our reaction mechanism is that we are going to be transferring the proton that is present on the oxygen atom from here over to the nitrogen to make an NH2 group over here. Let's show that happening. So the next step we'll go ahead with is a proton transfer step. So I'll go to mark step 3, proton transfer. And what's going to happen here is that we will take the lone pair electrons from the nitrogen, we'll bring that over and grab a proton from our oxygen atom, breaking that oxygen-hydrogen bond there. And so now we'll go ahead and draw out what would result from this step, where we are going to be moving that proton onto the nitrogen. That is additionally going to result in the positive formal charge now being on the nitrogen atom as well. So I have two sets of lone pairs now on the oxygen, because once we broke that oxygen-hydrogen bond here that I'm highlighting on the reactant, those lone pair electrons go onto the oxygen. Our nitrogen atom has its lone pair of electrons that it's picked up a proton using, so that becomes an extra NH group. So now we have NH2 here. And calculating the formal charge on the nitrogen atom, the nitrogen is going to have a positive formal charge now. And at this point, what happens is then just a shift in electrons to take the oxygen lone pair, bring that down to make a carbonyl group, a carbon-oxygen double bond. And the pi bond can go out into the nitrogen then to create a second resonance structure. I'm going to use a resonance arrow to represent this, because notice how we haven't moved any atoms here. We moved only electrons, so technically this qualifies as a resonance that we're showing here rather than an actual step of the mechanism. So I'm going ahead and drawing out that other resonance structure, because this other resonance structure that I'm drawing will be informative in showing us what's happening next. So in this second resonance structure now, the positive charge is shared with the oxygen atom here, giving us this as our current intermediate. I'm moving the lone pair down to make a pi bond between carbon and oxygen, and along with that, moving this pi bond between carbon and nitrogen out onto the nitrogen, so nitrogen now has a lone pair and no formal charge. Now that we have accomplished that, on to the next step. And the next step here is that we have a carbon that is electrophilic. That's the carbon atom right here is an electrophilic carbon, the one I just put the partial positive charge on. Is certainly quite electrophilic, because we could draw a resonance structure, a third resonance structure, where we took the pi bond and we moved it out onto the oxygen. That would put the positive charge on this carbon as well. So for a variety of reasons, this carbon that I'm highlighting is quite electrophilic. And therefore, what's going to happen then is that carbon is prone to attack by a nucleophile. And so we're going to get now another nucleophilic attack going on, which is that the nucleophile still is water floating around here. So the nucleophilic water is going to come in and attack that carbon, the carbon electrophile. So we'll go ahead and show that. I'm going to show my water in purple here. So water, using its lone pair of electrons, comes in, forms a covalent bond to this carbon. That forces the pi electrons out onto the oxygen, like so. And we'll go ahead and show what results from that here in the middle of the screen. So in the middle of the screen, we are redrawing the parts of the molecule that were in blue to start with. I'm just keeping blue here. And now we just have a carbon-oxygen double bond there because we took the pi electrons, we moved those out onto the oxygen, as I'm highlighting with my laser pointer here at the left. So going ahead and putting the two sets of lone pairs on the oxygen to keep track of those. Proton still bonded to that oxygen. And now we need to show the water has come in and formed a bond here. And I'm going to show that as OH2, like so. Positive formal charge on that oxygen atom. So now onward from here, what we will do then is a proton transfer, taking the proton from the oxygen, the one I'm circling right here, and transferring that over onto the nitrogen. So the nitrogen is going to act as a base. It's going to grab a proton from the oxygen here, which this water group that we've bonded in here is going to be acting as the acid, in other words. So we'll do a proton transfer within this. I am going to, in order to make space for this, I'm going to erase some of this old stuff here. It's a relatively long mechanism, so we need all the space we can get here. So going ahead and getting rid of this extra stuff so that we can plug in our next step. So now onward to step 5, which we were just discussing, is a proton transfer. So I'm going to plug in step 5, proton transfer. And that proton transfer is there's a proton being transferred onto the nitrogen atom. So, and that makes sense because nitrogens, as we learned in the last unit, are relatively basic. And so that nitrogen lone pair of electrons is pretty happy to grab that proton from the acid, breaking the oxygen-hydrogen bond. And technically this step could be shown intermolecularly or intramolecularly. We just need to definitely show that a base comes in, removes this proton from the acid, and our base nitrogen picks up a proton in this proton transfer series. So now we'll go ahead and draw out our product of that step. Drawing out our product here. Now we have, rather than H2O up top, we're going to just put that in as OH. And coming off to the right here, I now have NH3+, because the nitrogen now has 4 covalent bonds and no lone pair electrons. So now we are almost to home base here with this particular reaction. I'm going to go ahead and draw another arrow here to indicate onward to the next step. And what's going to happen in the next step, which I'll label step 6, is that now that we have protonated the nitrogen, and we have this NH3+, that is a relatively capable leaving group now that it's protonated, because if we break it away, it can leave as a neutral molecule, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So we'll go ahead and take one of the two hydroxy groups. It doesn't matter which one since they're fully symmetrical here and here. Pick one of those two hydroxy groups and bring the lone pair down to make a pi bond with the carbon as the leaving group leaves, like so. And now we'll go ahead and draw out what results from that. So what results from that is we have now a carbon-oxygen double bond. We still have one set of lone pair electrons in that oxygen. Going to have a positive charge on the oxygen now. And over here, we'll have an OH group. The leaving group, NH3, has left as a neutral molecule. And now we are almost to the finish line here. This structure we have drawn looks just like a carboxylic acid, except it's got an extra proton. And so the very final step of this reaction mechanism, step 7, is deprotonation. So I'm just going to label that deprotonation to give our final carboxylic acid product. All right, and step 6, which I did not previously label, we'll go ahead and fill that in, is that the leaving group leaves. That was our amine group breaking away, ammonia in this case. And now onward to the deprotonation step. And for the deprotonation step, we can bring in a variety of bases. We could just bring in another unit of water. We could use the amine as our base, whatever we'd like to do there. We just need something to act as a base. So NH3 could come in, grab that proton if you want, break that oxygen-hydrogen bond. And now we will go ahead and write out our product here, our carbonyl group, OH, as our final product of this reaction, as well as our inorganic product, NH4+, since we used ammonia as our base to deprotonate our acid here. So in our grand finale, we end up with our carboxylic acid product. And relating the starting structure, going back to our net reaction, which I'm highlighting now in purple. In our net reaction, what we are ultimately doing is we are doing a nucleophilic acyl substitution reaction where we are replacing the nitrile group with the carboxylic acid group. So it's a nucleophilic acyl substitution reaction where what's being substituted is that the nitrogen is being swapped out with the OOH group, the carbonyl group and the hydroxy group of our carboxylic acid. And we're going through that via a series of the electron transfers that we see in this relatively long mechanism. Now, to test our understanding of what we've learned today, we'll do an example problem here to wrap up, which is show how to synthesize the carboxylic acid compound that we see here from an alkyl halide. This is indicating that it might not be just one reaction that we need to do in order to directly transform an alkyl halide into the carboxylic acid product via one reaction, but instead we may need to run multiple reactions. So we're trying to show a pathway to go from an alkyl halide all the way to our carboxylic acid as our final product. So the way we attack this is we think retrosynthetically, backwards, one step at a time, until we've worked our way back to an alkyl halide starting material. So in order to do that, the first thing we need to ask is, in one reaction, how could we go from something to a carboxylic acid product that is this particular structure? Well, a general way that we learned to do that was the nitrile hydrolysis reaction. So we could try nitrile hydrolysis as a route to do this, where we reacted with acid and water And what that reaction always did was converted a nitrile group into a carboxylic acid group. So therefore, our starting material for this particular reaction, thinking backwards, would need to be a molecule that had 2 carbon atoms, with one of those being part of a nitrile group, because we have 2 carbons here, here, and here, and this hydrolysis reaction does not add or delete any carbons. So 2 carbons there means we needed 2 carbons on this chain here and here in our starting material, and that hydrolysis reaction would result in transformation of the nitrile group here into that carboxylic acid group that we need. So that takes us back one step in this reaction, and then looking backwards even further, we have to say, do we know a way to make a nitrile group? And even better, if we know a way to transform an alkyl halide of some sort into that nitrile group. And indeed, we do know how to go about doing that. We can do that using an SN2 reaction where we react sodium cyanide as our nucleophile, providing a nucleophilic carbon atom, with an alkyl halide. Specifically, it has to be an alkyl halide that has a primary carbon bonded to the leaving group to get that SN2 reaction going on. So in order to do this, what we can do is we can say, all right, we have this with a Cl leaving group or some other halogen. And what's going to happen here to make sure that we're on track with this is that the Cn, carb anion, acts as the nucleophile, coming in attacking the non-sterically hindered electrophilic carbon as the leaving group leaves in this SN2 reaction, creating a new carbon-carbon bond here in the molecule. So this chain of 1 carbons grows to a chain of 2 carbons, with that carbon at the end being a nitrile group, just like we have here, a 2-carbon chain. And so this provides us with the entire route of how to go about synthesizing the carboxylic acid product that we see here from an alkyl halide starting material in this 2-step series. Keeping in mind along the way that we need to account for how many carbon atoms our final product needs to have relative to our starting material, and being mindful that we are creating a new carbon-carbon bond along the way. So keeping track of how many carbons are available at each step is really important so that you don't accidentally add or delete a carbon atom along the way.